Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
When I set out to write this book some years ago, I was really not criticized, but people really wondered why would I do that? And first of all, people told me no one will read the book about Israel. And but then there was the argument, there are so many Israel books, who needs another one? And it's true, there are so many great Israel books. Why another one? I had two answers to that after giving it some thought. One was the personal one, which is that ever since I remember myself, I was aware of the fact that I was born in a unique land, to a unique nation, and into a unique historical event. And I had to decipher it for myself, to understand what's this happening, this historical happening that I was born into and that I participate in. So that was like the personal existential need, existential not in the Iranian strategic meaning, but in the personal one. But then there was another answer, because as I looked at that Israel shelf in the library, I've noticed that while there are so many great books that are history books and political books and sociological books and political books and polemics and more polemics and more polemics, there has not been written for a long time, if ever, but definitely for a long time, a personal book, non-fiction book, by an Israeli who does real Israeli soul-searching and looks at the overall Israeli experience. And I came to the conclusion that this was no accident, that the reason that there isn't such a book is that we've lost our narrative. This is deeply troubling, because any nation needs a narrative. Definitely an immigrant's nation needs a narrative. And definitely a small nation that is in many ways fragile and endangered needs a narrative. And the irony with Israel is that we had a narrative before we had anything else. To begin with, Judaism comes from the book. But Zionism too began with a very strong sense of story, of purpose, of meaning. We knew where we were coming from and where we want to go. And the sad thing is that what happened over the years is that while we became stronger politically, economically, militarily, while Israel became a very robust Israel, the narrative disintegrated. We've lost it. In my mind, there are two main reasons. There are several reasons. There are two main reasons for that. One is 1967. That's jet lag. As the day after the Six-Day War, the seventh day of the Six-Day War, our narrative split. My older friend, the great Israeli poet Chaim Guri, says that the old Israeli ethos was that of the Hanitzurim v'atzodkim, the besieged and the righteous. And that collapsed the day after the Six-Day War. We weren't aware of it immediately. And it became worse, and it becomes worse every year that passes. Because our one narrative is split into at least two major ones. There are several others. So that's one reason that the narrative disintegrated. But then there is another reason. Usually people say or think that the problem with Israel is extremism. Nationalist extremism, religious extremism. And in many ways, it's correct. Israel has a serious problem of nationalistic and religious extremism. We'll get to that. But Israel has another problem that usually people do not talk about, and that's cynicism. The problem with the non-extremist Israelis, with the big center of Israeli life, is that ever since 1973, and while the first problem emerged in 1967, the second is a result of 1973, we've become cynical about ourselves. This is a major problem that few talk about. In many ways, 1973, the Milchemet Yom Kippur, is our World War I. Because not only did we experience terrible bloodshed and everything was shaken in our self-confidence, but 1973 and then 1977, but as a result of that war, the ancien regime of Israel collapsed. Just like the monarchies and the old European order based on the king and God collapsed in Europe after 1914. The old Laborite Zionist leadership and structure and mentality and values have collapsed after 73, but they were not replaced by any other force that really takes overall control and responsibility. And as a result, our attitude in Israel became, we moved from one extreme to another. While before that we were too mobilized, too committed, too revolutionary, too ideological. In the 40 years that have passed since then, we've become too critical, too judgmental, too cynical. In many ways, we've lost the ability to see the wonder of Israel. We're so bogged down into the friction and the debates and the pettiness and the personal fights and all that, that we've stopped seeing how wonderful and amazing Israel is in many ways, with all its flaws and all its problems. So that's, in my mind, what happened. What I tried to do was to write a book that will bring the Israel story back in a human way. My book is about history in many ways, but it's not a history book. It's definitely not an academic history book. My book is relevant to politics, but it's not a political book. I have my beliefs, I have strong opinions, I'm an opinionated guy. I did not use the book, I did not write the book, and I did not use the book to promote my ideology. I tried to bring the human story back. I wanted to let people to see the amazing human phenomena Israel is by using the life stories of people and by being totally out there myself. I totally exposed myself emotionally, personally, all my dilemmas, all my fears. And this is what I thought was needed, to make Israel something you can relate to emotionally, personally, so you can see the human phenomenon. I've asked myself 3 questions. In my mind, they are the real important Israel questions. Why Israel? What's Israel? Will Israel? But I did not answer these questions with arguments, with a theory, with thesis. I answered them, or tried to answer them, with this grand story told in my own personal way through my own eyes. Obviously, I began with my own beginning, with the arrival in the Jaffa port of April 1897 of my great-grandfather, Herbert Bentridge, who came from Britain. My great-grandfather was in many ways 100 years ahead of his time, but because he was a successful, privileged British Jew. Apart from the fact that he was Jewish, he was absolutely a Victorian gentleman. He loved the Queen, he loved the Empire, he loved Shakespeare, he loved the theater, he loved the Lake District. He was as British can be. So I asked myself, why would such a person travel from the middle of the world's capital, and London of the 1890s is by far the world's capital. Why would he travel to that remote, desolate wasteland Palestine was? And I came up with two answers. One was the fact that he being a junior among the founders of Zionists, he was not really important Zionist leader. He had a relationship with Herzl. Herzl thought that he was a part of this group of British gentlemen that would help him to get the British Empire to support Zionism. And Herzl expected him to write a report about Palestine, whether it's fit for colonization or to be populated by the Jewish people. But he was not a major player. But he and this group of the founding fathers and mothers of Zionism realized at the end of the 19th century that Europe was becoming a death trap to its Jews. Europe was always vicious to us. Let us not forget this, especially these days when Europeans like to preach us. I'm willing to listen to anything they have to say, but I always put it in historical context. We are Europe's ultimate other. For 1,500 years we were. In many ways, we are Europe's ultimate victims for 1,500 years. But what these founding fathers and mothers of Zionism realized, that the new, modern, enlightened Europe is becoming even more dangerous than the old religious Europe. That the new kind of racist-based anti-Semitism is becoming even more lethal. So they did not know that the 20th century will produce such places as Auschwitz and Treblinka. They did not know that there will be such vicious inventions as gas chambers. But they realized that there is no hope for Jews in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe. They realized that they must act to save the Jews physically, literally. Faced with the most radical challenge, they went for the most radical solution possible. What they did is they launched the most dramatic revolution, the most successful revolution of the 20th century. Because what they did is to transfer people from one continent to another and to take a land and to build a nation and to revive a language. So a people that was homeless will have a home. That the people that was about to be murdered would be saved. And when people nowadays attack Zionism and describe it as some sort of colonialist movement, I feel real sense of outrage. There is nothing more distorted than to claim that. Because we, as I said, are Europe's ultimate victims who used at the last moment with sophistication some European power, some European know-how in order to save ourselves from Europe. And the one sin Zionism really has is that it was too late. That's a sin. If we've launched our remarkable, benign, just project 20, 30 years earlier, if we had had a Jewish state in the 1920s rather than in 1948, we would have saved most, if not all, of the 6 million who perished. So this is the first reason that my great-grandfather and his friends went to Palestine. They saw a problem, they had amazing insight, and they acted with imagination, determination, and sophistication to do the impossible. But they had another insight. And this is where my great-grandfather's unique position as a privileged Jew at that period of time, as a Jew, as I said, that was 100 years ahead of his time, is relevant. because my great-grandfather already saw that his sons will go to Cambridge. He already saw that his daughters will be faced with the dilemma of how to be 100% British and 100% Jewish. So he and his peers saw in the late 19th century not only the existential physical challenge facing the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, they saw that there is another challenge coming for the Jews that is exactly the opposite in Western Europe and North America. Because they realized that the old Jewish formula, based on what I describe as the two great Gs, is not working anymore. For 1,500 to 2,000 years, the Jews maintained their existence in the diaspora because of the intimate relationship they had with God on the one hand, and the defense of the walls of the ghetto on the other hand. This was the secret Jewish formula that enabled us to exist throughout the times in the diaspora. But once the pogroms will be over, the early Zionists understood. Once brutal, violent anti-Semitism will be over, we will be faced with the exact opposite problem. Because while ultra-Orthodox Jewish existence will not be in jeopardy, a Jewish ghetto can survive in Brooklyn or Antwerp or anywhere else. An ultra-Orthodox Jewish existence will be with us in 100 years' time and 1,000 years' time. But non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish existence is in jeopardy. So in many ways, what these amazing Zionists did is to try to preempt in the 1890s. They tried to preempt the Pew Report. They saw the challenge facing everyone sitting in this room today. And they realized if we are to have a modern, non-ultra-Orthodox Jewish civilization, we need a home, a national home that will be a powerhouse for Jewish identity, for a modern, new Jewish identity. Without that, we will not have the anchor that will enable us to survive in the 20th century, 21st century, and the 22nd century. So these were the two brilliant ideas that brought the early Zionists there. And this is what made Israel possible. And when you see Israel today, robust and lively, you see how deep the need we had to go there was. So many people have claimed that Israel is an artificial creation of the great empires. Well, what we see today is that the real artificial creations of the great empires were many of the nation states surrounding us, who are collapsing in front of our very eyes. Syria was artificial. Iraq was artificial. Libya was artificial. Israel was not. The deep need of a real people, a people that is on the one hand one of the most remarkable species there are, a people that has contributed so much to humanity, but a people that is on the other hand an endangered species, endangered physically and endangered spiritually. So this remarkable endangered species, us, needed that home desperately. Thank you. But then there was the flaw. And we have to be candid in addressing the flaw. Because when my great-grandfather arrived in Palestine, he would not see that the city of Jaffa, to which he arrived, was predominantly an Arab city, with a great ancient Jewish past, but predominantly an Arab city. And he would not see that right next to the beautiful, amazing, emerging Mikveh Israel, there were so many Palestinian villages. And he would not see that next to the promising, magical Rishon LeZion of 1897 with its amazing winery, the most sophisticated in the Middle East. There were the city of Lida and the city of Ramle. And he would not see that while he took the train, the newly built French train that took him up to Jerusalem, there were so many Palestinian villages along the road. And he would not see the Palestinian villages in what we now call the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, all the way up to the Galilee. Now, I do not accept the claim that we were some conquistadors that conquered a land that's not ours. The land was and is ours. It is our ancient homeland. We always yearned for it. We have every right for it. I'm not one of those who claim that we took over some Palestine that was there. There was no political Palestine. There was no Palestinian Republic. There was no Palestinian kingdom. The Palestinian people did not yet define itself as a Palestinian people. That happened decades, generations later, partly because of the clash with the Zionists. So the entire Middle East, and that country specifically, were in a kind of vague situation, a kind of tribal situation under the declining Ottoman Empire. So we did not, and this is so important to stress while our adversaries are spreading disinformation. We did not conquer a Palestine that was established. But there were 500,000 Arabs in the Holy Land. And my great-grandfather would not see them. Why? Because he, like his friends, were so desperate for Palestine. The need to establish that home there was so deep, so profound, that they had to overlook the existence of the other. They had a kind of deep need to be blind. So it's all there. In 1897, you have the seeds of the triumph, the need, the determination, the brilliancy, the justice. But you have on the other side the seeds of the tragedy. Because the moment the first Zionists walked into that land, in that region, they walked into a 100-year war. The conflict became an inevitable part of our existence. Inevitable. I'm an anti-occupation person. But the conflict between us and our neighbors is not about occupation. I oppose settlements, and I oppose settlements from the first moment. But the conflict is not about settlements. The conflict is a deep conflict that has religious dimensions, historical dimensions, social dimensions. And at its heart, it has the failure of our neighbors to recognize the fact that there is a Jewish people, a real Jewish people that has a right to determine itself in a real Jewish state that is legitimate and lively in that region, in that land. This is the heart of the conflict. But then, fast forward, after I traveling in space and time through not the entire saga, but like I chose events and people and places that I thought tell the larger story by telling a specific story. That was the way the book is constructed. But at the end, the last chapter, I go in the footsteps of my great-grandfather and look at my homeland. And I ask myself, what have we achieved and what have we not? Where have we succeeded and where have we failed? So what I see is, on the one hand, the most endangered nation on the face of the earth. The most endangered nation on the face of the earth. And again, I oppose occupation. I hope we can end it. But I have issue with the people who just look at that and don't see that Israel's existence has two pillars. One is occupation and the other is intimidation. And if you do not, and usually what happens is that people on the left focus all the time on occupation and ignore intimidation, while people on the right focus on intimidation and ignore occupation. And the only real way to look at it is to look at the complexity, at both, and deal with both. So here is the intimidation. There is an inherent tension between 6.2 Jews living in Israel and many, not all, but many of the 1.6 billion Muslims surrounding them. Especially because the land is a holy land and Jerusalem is a sacred city, and we are the infidels occupying that land. That creates an inherent tension. Then there is the inherent tension between 8 million Israelis and the 370 million Arabs surrounding them. Not all of them, and many of them are now our friends. The more desperate they are about Tehran, the Islamic Brotherhood, and Washington, the more they are our friends. They cling to us, they talk to us, they actually trust us. But don't get it wrong. 13 years ago, I interviewed a certain person with whom I have some disagreements, Professor Edward Said. And at the end of this remarkable interview conducted in the Columbia University, he told me, "You know, Ari, I'm concerned about you Jews. Because the Middle East is very cruel to its minorities. And at the end of the day, with all your power, you are a minority. The Arab world has an inherent problem in accepting non-Arab entities as legitimate in that part of the world. Ask the Kurds, ask the Copts, ask the Maronites in Lebanon. It's not only about us, but it's definitely about us. So while I think we should have peace, we should do everything to have peace, and we can have peace, we should know that the tension is there. Inherent tension between the Jewish nation state and many of the Arab movements surrounding it. But then the third threat, the inner one, is the one with the Palestinians. Because as I said, I want to reach out to moderate Palestinians. I want to have peace with them. I'm willing to pay enormous prices. But I know that for many, if not most Palestinians, there is a deep difficulty in accepting the legitimacy of our existence in that land. Most of them have a difficulty getting over the past, and most of them have difficulty accepting the legitimacy of the Jewish democratic state as a legitimate entity. So this creates a situation that is no other. The Israeli condition is basically the condition of a people that is endangered. No other OECD nation, and we like so much to see ourselves as part of the OECD, and we are, but no other OECD nation has such a challenge. The uniqueness of the Israeli condition is that we live on the edge. Inherently, we live on the edge. You have many problems in America. Your health care is not the most amazing. The way Washington works now is not very inspiring. But there is not an American in this room who has doubt whether America will be here in 100 years' time. It might be a conservative America, it might be a progressive America. It might be a superpower, it might be a middle-sized power. But America will be here. No Israeli can be confident that Israel will be there in 100 years' time. Most Israelis, almost all Israelis, have a difficulty expressing this. They know it, they are aware of it, it influences them, but they don't express it. But this makes the Israeli condition, the mental condition, the psychological condition, different than any other advanced nation in the world. So all this is on the troubling, the problematic side. But then there is the most amazing side. Because the beauty of Israel, the amazing thing about Israel, is that we have turned our life on the edge to a source of power. Living dangerously did not make us desperate or passive or pessimistic. On the contrary. On the contrary. What you see in Israel is the most amazing spirit of doing things, of moving forward, not lingering on pains and fears. So while Zionism failed in establishing what it set out to build, which is a utopia, the kibbutz dream is shattered. There will be no socialist paradise there. We will not have a perfect social justice society there. But the amazing thing that Zionism managed to produce, to create, is the most astonishing, robust, free society one can imagine. We are innovative, and we are creative, and we are sensual, and we are sexy. We make more babies than any other OECD country. In every realm of life, technology, economy, arts, literature, you name it. We are as lively as can be. As lively as can be. So in many ways, when I ask myself, why Israel? Because there is a need to have a home for the homeless people. What's Israel? Vitality against all odds. Will Israel? Depends on us. It depends if we will have the wisdom and the insight that our founding fathers and mothers had. If we'll be able to take that astonishing energy Israel has and to put it back into our politics, into the way we handle our public affairs. Our society is amazing, our individuals are amazing, our politics is unworthy. So if we take that energy and reform ourselves based on two principles, we can do it. We need to know that while we want tikkun olam and we work for tikkun olam, we need tikkun Israel. And we need to know, we need to have a feeling that in many ways we've lost. Ahavat Israel. At the end of the day, we are entitled to love ourselves. We are not that bad. We are not that bad. And if we will learn to correct and change and get things done right, while loving ourselves again, and while creating love between our different tribes, and between the great Israeli Jewish community there and the great American Jewish community here. If we'll do that, we can flourish. Because at the end of the day, the Jewish people have created two amazing achievements. The first half of the 20th century was our worst ever. And we had many worse, very bad centuries. But in the first half of the 20th century, we lost every third Jew. Every third Jew. Think of this room. Every third Jew. No nation experienced such a thing, and even us, we did not experience it. But then, in the most remarkable way possible, in the second half of the 20th century, you created the man-made wonder of the perfect diaspora in this country, and we have created the wonder of Jewish sovereignty in that country. And the two are interdependent, and the two are now challenged. But if we work together, if we have the right attitude, we can prevail and we can deal with the challenges. Because at the end of the day, what you see here and what you see in the most dramatic way in Israel is a people that have come from death and are in many ways threatened by death, but have chosen life. Israel and the Jewish people are the most remarkable endeavors of life. So let's take that celebration of life and turn it into a force that deals with all that we are faced with in the 21st century, so we succeed in this century just as we had in the second half of the 20th century.
With what's happening in our administration, we're about to see the recrudescence of the Iranian Empire, or the Persian Empire, and obviously a big threat to Israel. And wanted to know what your thoughts are on the new political rearrangement. All the countries that exist that were made at the end of World War I will be gone, and they will be reconstituted.
First of all, I'll begin with totally agreeing with the end of what you said at the end, which is that the weakness of the inherent weakness we see today in the Arab world, which will not go away, creates a situation where the strongest powers in the region are the non-Arab ones: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. Saudi Arabia is playing a certain game, but it has its inherent weaknesses as well. So definitely, it's either they will be influenced by positive powers, the West and moderate coalition within the Middle East, or you will have Iranian influence that it'll be much easier for the Iranians to penetrate and to have growing influence in such places as Iraq and other places. So you're absolutely right there. But let me give you my interpretation of the overall Iran issue. I do not think that Iran should be an Israel issue. And it should definitely not be a Benjamin Netanyahu issue. Iran is dramatic for us. I am a proud Iran alarmist. For 10 years, I've been writing about it, shouting about it. I've been ridiculed by my colleagues, my friends, my family members. They kept asking me, what is it? Why do you care so much about these funny centrifuges over there? I think it's dramatic for us, but it's the wrong way to address it. Because Iran is a civilization challenge. If Iran would go nuclear, within weeks, Saudi Arabia will go nuclear. Within months or a year, one or two of the other Gulf countries might go nuclear. Within a few years, Egypt and Turkey will go nuclear, possibly Algeria. Israel will have to change its very responsible nuclear policy. So what you will have in the Middle East is a multipolar nuclear system, something that was never, ever tried, not even in the Cold War. So we are going to have a wild experiment with a multipolar nuclear system in the world's most dangerous, unstable, irrational, and violent regions. If that's not hell, I don't know what hell is. Now, I don't think that the Iranians will drop a bomb on Tel Aviv a year after they get it. But even if there are no apocalyptic events, just the emergence of this new hellish Middle East will change totally the psychology, the economy of the life we have in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, all Middle East people. This is not about Israel. But within a short time, what will happen to Tel Aviv within years will happen in European capitals, to Berlin and London and Paris within a few more years. And it will happen in New York and Chicago and Boston within a decade. So a nuclear Iran will change our world, literally, literally. One of the things that people do not take for granted is the international community's most amazing achievement in the last 70 years, which is to control the nuclear genie. But if Iran will go nuclear, the genie will be out of the bottle. The 21st century will be about nuclear fears and nuclear events, nuclear terror and nuclear horror. Now, we will not go back to the old apocalyptic fears of the Cold War, because no one will have the ability to destroy humanity. But once nuclear capabilities spread throughout the Third World, first in the Middle East and then elsewhere, there will be no way to stop it. This stability, this amazing post-World War II stability, will be totally shattered. But Iran is not only a civilization challenge. Iran is a civilization failure. And this is what most people in Washington, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Berlin, Paris don't like to admit. Because we have failed. Basically, the Iranians are ahead of the game. Every Israeli prime minister and every American president in recent years was committed not to have Iran where Iran already is. 19,000 Iranian centrifuges was out of the question only a few years ago. They all, Washington, Jerusalem, never mind, they're all committed not to have that. But we did not focus on it. It was so easy to deal with Iran 10 years ago and 7 years ago and 5 years ago. But America wasted its energy and political capital and strength in the wrong places. We in Israel, too, were dormant for too long. For too long. There's a limit to what to criticize others because we were dormant too long. We did not focus on this. So what we are faced now, in my mind, is really the last chance to resolve that in a reasonable way. If it's not hoping it's not minute after midnight, it's a minute before midnight. So when there was this talk of this interim agreement now, and some said it was a historical mistake, and some said it's historical success, I said neither. I said, this is a historical challenge. It's a historical opportunity. Because the moment these 6 months end, we must be faced with a very clear choice. Either there is a deal that is a good deal that really solves this, or we go back to full political, I stress, political economic warfare against this regime. Because if we will not be tough, if we will not have assertive diplomacy that tries to deal with this in an assertive diplomatic way, we will really end up with this terrible T-junction of bomb or bombing in which both scenarios are catastrophic. Both. So these are the crucial months. Crucial months. And we must at last open our eyes. I talked of blindness before. The entire West was blind to see how dramatic the Iran issue is. We made so many mistakes. There were some successes, but so many mistakes. And this is the moment. This is the year to wake up.
I'd like to go back to your point about Avat Yisrael. Okay. In your really marvelous book, I felt that, as you yourself indicated, it was addressed to a particular population in Israel, those who were in need of a renewal of their narrative. There is another population that's also that it might have been, I think, was ignored, and that is not the Haredim or the ultra-Orthodox, and not the secular Zionists, but a group of people who are traditionalists and who are themselves experiencing, I think, a spiritual renewal. So I'd like to know what relationship that has in terms of your portrait of Israel, because it seems to me that that's such a vital ingredient of Zionism itself, that in the land, culture and spirit are going to be renewed in a particular Israeli way that's very different and distinctive and can contribute to the Jewish world.
I totally agree. I think there is among the promising and processes and phenomena in Israel is this spiritual renewal you're talking about. I actually think there is an interesting, there can be an interesting dialogue between this Israeli traditional Judaism that is being revived and many of the conservative and reform movements in this country that in different ways and with people with different background actually are approaching Judaism in ways that have some similarity. I mean, with such respect to tradition and culture and the past, but having relaxed, being more relaxed about observance. And so there is something that is happening, is kind of grassroots Judaism evolving in Israel can correspond to things that you've had here for a long time. So I agree that this is promising, and this is part of vitality. Is not only economical and physical and there is spiritual vitality and revival in Israel in the last 20, 30 years in a very striking way. The issue is that this is not political yet. My claim is that we have to take all that. I mean, the Israeli civic society is so impressive, so rich. As I say, our lives in Israel between wars are actually so, with all of the problems, they are so inspiring in so many ways. But in my mind, I referred to 73 before, in my mind, since that ancien regime collapsed, the old labor, and it had to be replaced. It was anachronistic by that time, and we should not have one party rule for 100 years. But in many ways, it was never replaced by an alternative force from right or left. Because I look at envy with what, for instance, the Thatcherites did in Britain. I'm not a Thatcherite, that's not my ideology. But they saw that Britain was in a deep crisis. They thought through the ideas. They had serious intellectual thinking, how do you revive it? They won power, and they did it, and they changed Britain, and they changed the world. In many ways, if you think of this country, you had Ronald Reagan's Morning in America on the one hand, and you had Bill Clinton reviving the Democratic Party in a way that responds to the new renewed market philosophy. In Israel, we didn't have that. We didn't have that. The Likud and the right never really, they went into the territories and built settlements. They never took responsibility the way the old Laborites had for the overall Israeli condition, dealing with all our challenges in a kind of comprehensive way. While the people on the left, the labor movement and the ones who succeeded it in many ways, they lived in a kind of of negative ethos. You know, they were against Begin, against Shamir, against the settlers, against the ultra-Orthodox, against the right. Fine, I'm against most of the above again. But that's not the point. You cannot be a protest movement. A lot of the Israeli politics became in many ways childish. And I'm not talking about the corruption elements and all that. I'm talking about you did not see a revival of a political class and a political ethos and a political leadership. And I'm not talking about this prime minister or another. Actually, most of our prime ministers personally were qualified people. I mean, we did not elect a moron as prime minister. You know, that was not the issue. The issue that all these prime ministers never created, they never went back to what really Ben-Gurion did. They never created a serving elite that is working, that looks at the overall issues and deals with all of them and tries to unite the tribes of Israel again on a new basis, because the old way was a kind of aggressive melting pot. So I have a lot of admiration for the founding fathers and mothers, but the price was really oppression of individuals, oppression of minorities. This had to change, and it changed. And in this sense, Israel, this liberated and colorful and free Israel is remarkable. It's a good thing, it's very good. But politically, you need a kind of new political deal that creates, not only changes the system, but brings back, you know, a kind of basic, because of understanding where we are, what we are faced with, and how do we energize ourselves, not only in all these amazing ways that we are energized, but to deal with our fundamental problems, because we are in a unique position. We are deeply and continuously challenged. So we cannot, you know, the world has a leadership problem, but first of all, ours seems sometimes even worse than some of the other nations. And we are challenged with such a situation that we cannot afford this. So just, you have to take all that energy, including the spiritual revival you talked about, and bring it into the renewed structure of a kind of re-energized or renewed Israeli republic that will deal with all that it has to deal with.
What do you think about the Kerry peace process?
Ideologically, I'm totally there. I had serious doubts whether this can work. And the doubts were based on two facts. One is that this has been tried 3-4 times in the past, and it failed. I admire Secretary Kerry's commitment, courage, his willingness. I'm sure he's trying to save the two-state solution. I'm sure he loves Israel. I'm sure he cares about us. I think his intentions are benign. I have real deep respect. But I think that given what I've said, not to have a plan B ready in case you fail is deeply irresponsible. Because the chances of failure are there. And the ramifications of failure will be horrific. Had I been Israel's prime minister, I would take the Olmert plan or the Barak plan or the Clinton parameters. I would give it to Yossi Beilin, who is our number one peacenik, and I will say, dear Yossi, take this plan, bring me this signed in 6 months. Do whatever is needed, bring this back signed, which is basically what Kerry is trying to do now. But I will not waste 1 minute waiting for this to happen because of my doubts. And I would use these 6 months to plan Plan B properly. So if within 6 months there isn't a final status peace agreement signed, really signed by Abbas, because several times in the past Abbas promised us that he's behind all kinds of papers, and then he didn't find the pen to sign them, actually. So I'm not willing to be fooled again. So I'll give it all the support. I'm willing to take all the extra miles, but a limited period of time, and see if it's really signed. Not this process in which every year we wait for peace next April and we get 30,000 more settlers by next November is ridiculous and dangerous, and it's killing us. So we must stop that. So if Yossi does not come with that document, what I would go, generally speaking, into the following. I think that we have to go for a sophisticated, creative, coordinated unilateralism, in which, but much more deeper, much more really creative than what we did in Gaza. So in my mind, what we should do is really two processes, where the Palestinians do their nation-building process gradually, while we go for our nation-saving process of ending occupation. Now, when there is no peace, you cannot end occupation overnight or over a year, and you cannot go back to the 67 lines. You have to go to a process which is gradual, cautious, and in which Israel begins, first of all. That's the first thing I'll do, with a total freeze of settlements beyond the barrier. Many people object to the barrier, and I understand why, although that's another issue. But the barrier line is a brilliant line, because it leaves 99% of the Palestinians east of it and approximately 75% of the settlers west of it. So this is the kind of the line that you should take as a reference point until there is peace, until people can actually sign the peace. But if you begin with a freeze beyond that line, then at least, first of all, the bleeding to death of the two-state solution stops, because settlement activity is killing the two-state solution, and it's killing Israel's legitimacy. The moment you have a freeze beyond the barrier, you begin the dynamics that are going in the right direction. Then, in my mind, the goal should be create a two-state state. Rather than a two-state solution, the goal is to create a two-state state. Again, until there is peace. So if Israel gradually pulls out of small parts of the West Bank, but in each part that it withdraws, you actually have understanding, not a signed agreement with the Palestinians, with the constructive Fayyad-like forces in the West Bank. And wherever we withdraw, there is a new Rawabi built. There is a real huge economic development project. So it's not like Gaza that we just walk away and Hamas takes over. I think that the good news, that the things that you can work with, is really the Fayyad process, which is America's only success in the Middle East in the last decade, and a very impressive the good news that came out of this conflict. So if we help the Fayyad forces by creating a situation that every year, even every quarter, they have larger economic, political, and geographical space, but they do not have to make the ideological concessions right now that they cannot make, but they know that actually they have a better life. Now, if you combine that with the regional players, the moderate Sunni Arabs who want to cooperate with Israel now, cannot, in my mind, again, I'd love to be proven wrong, it's difficult for them to make the great concessions, but they would love to support such a process that helps to chaperone a new Palestine, that creates good news rather than bad news out of the conflict. And for America, this is a great opportunity to create the alliance, because right now so many of America's friends in the Middle East feel, I don't want to use strong words, but they are very unhappy with what has happened. And they lost the respect and trust of American leadership. If this process of creating this a Plan B in Palestine is actually endorsed by our neighboring Sunni Arabs, led by America, it gives it a political substance, and it actually, while dealing with the problem of occupation, it gives the entire region a kind of prospect of a realistic movement forward that helps the moderates throughout and helps us fight the radicals throughout the region.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.